It was 5 degrees in Boston, but the real chill was inside the auditorium. My father, Mark, didn't look at the stage. He looked at his Rolex. Then he leaned over his whisper, cutting through the anticipatory silence like a scalpel. "We're leaving," he said, his voice flat and transactional. "The dealership closes at 5. We're picking up Alexis's Bentley. You can take the bus home." I didn't blink. I didn't beg. I just watched as he and my mother Stephanie stood up. They turned their backs on me exactly 10 seconds before the dean called my name. The seats beside me weren't just empty. They were a statement. Before I tell you how I made them regret that walkout for the rest of their lives, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I watched the heavy oak doors swing shut behind them, sealing off the auditorium from the lobby. The draft that followed them out wasn't just cold air. It was the final exhalation of a dying contract. Most daughters would have crumbled. They would have stared at the empty seats with tears blurring their vision, wondering why they weren't enough. But I didn't feel hollow. I felt efficient. For 22 years, I had been an asset they refused to appraise correctly, a line item they marked as a loss. Now they had voluntarily divested. I reached into the pocket of my gown and pulled out my phone. I wasn't checking for an apology text. I was checking the market close. The notification was right there at the top of the screen. The acquisition of Logistech, the artificial intelligence supply chain company I had built from a bus stop bench, had just been finalized. The valuation was confirmed. $1.2 billion. I stared at the number. It was clean. It was factual. It was the only validation I required. While my father was rushing to a dealership to sign a lease he couldn't afford on a car that would lose 20% of its value the moment it touched the pavement, I had just become the state's youngest self-made billionaire. The irony was so mathematically perfect it almost made me smile. On stage, the dean cleared his throat. He didn't read the next name on the list. Instead, he stepped away from the podium and adjusted the microphone, a break in protocol that silenced the restless crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming with a gravity that echoed off the high ceilings. "We have a deviation from the program today. Usually we celebrate potential. Today we are celebrating realized history." He scanned the crowd, looking for me. I didn't wave. I just sat there, my hands folded over my phone. Among us today is a student who, while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, quietly architected the software that now powers 60% of global shipping logistics. It is my distinct honor to announce that this university's youngest graduate is also its first self-made billionaire alumni. The silence held for a heartbeat, and then it shattered. The auditorium erupted, heads turned, people stood up. The applause was a physical wave crashing over the rows of seats. It was a roar of recognition, of awe. And just 50 feet away on the other side of those thick oak doors, my parents were walking through the parking lot complaining about the wind, completely oblivious that they were walking away from the sun. They missed the thunder. They missed the history. They chose the Bentley. The distance to the stage was only 50 yards, yet it felt like crossing a border between two warring nations. I moved with the steady hydraulic precision of the machines I coded. When I reached the center, the dean handed me my diploma. He held on to it for a second longer than necessary, smiling as if he wanted to share in the glory. I took it gently but firmly. To me, this piece of paper wasn't a ticket to the future. It was a receipt. It was proof of a transaction completed. I had fulfilled my obligation to be the good student, the quiet daughter, the invisible worker. Descending the stairs, the applause still ringing in my ears, the only sound I focused on was the internal click of a lock engaging. I stopped just before returning to my seat. I pulled my phone out one last time. I opened my contacts list. There they were: Mark, Stephanie, names that used to mean safety, now just labels on expired files. I didn't hesitate. Nostalgia is an inefficiency I cannot afford. I pressed edit. I scrolled to the bottom. I hit delete contact. Then I did it again. It took 3 seconds to erase them from my digital life. It would take them a lifetime to realize they had been deleted from my real one. The ledger was opening, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the pen. The question everyone asks is, how? How do you hide a company valued at $1.2 billion while living in your parents' guest bedroom? How do you build an empire under the nose of a father who checks the mileage on his car every night? The answer is simple. You use their own arrogance as a cloaking device. For 4 years, I was a ghost in my own life. While Alexis was being paraded around country clubs and tennis courts accumulating trophies for participation, I was living in the gray space between the hours of 4 a.m. and midnight. My office wasn't a garage in Silicon Valley. It was the back row of the number 66 bus. I can still smell it, that specific mix of wet wool, diesel fumes, and stale coffee. That was my boardroom. While my classmates were sleeping off hangovers, I was up before the sun, shivering at a stop that didn't have a shelter, waiting for the transport that my parents refused to provide. I had a refurbished laptop that weighed 8 pounds and had a battery life of 40 minutes. I used every single one of them. While the bus crawled through traffic, I wasn't scrolling social media. I was writing code. I was optimizing shipping routes for freight companies in Singapore and Rotterdam. By the time I walked into my first lecture, I had already overseen the movement of 10,000 shipping containers across the Atlantic. But here is where the psychology gets interesting. You would think my parents would notice. You would think they'd see the dark circles under my eyes, the way I was constantly typing, the way I started wearing cashmere instead of polyester. But they didn't. There is a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. It describes the mental stress people feel when they encounter information that contradicts their existing beliefs. To protect themselves, their brains simply delete the contradictory data. My parents had a story they needed to believe. Alexis was the star and Savannah was the cautionary tale. That narrative was the load-bearing wall of their egos. If I was successful, then their neglect wasn't just cruel, it was stupid. And my father could not tolerate feeling stupid. So he hallucinated a reality that fit his ego. When I came home at 11 p.m., exhausted from closing a deal with a logistics giant in Germany, he didn't see a CEO. He saw a struggling student. "Still trying to pass basic economics, Savannah?" he would ask, barely looking up from his iPad. "Maybe if you were smarter, you wouldn't have to study so hard." I never corrected him. I learned early on that my invisibility wasn't a curse. It was a superpower. It was the ultimate security clearance. If they knew what I was building, they would have tried to control it. They would have demanded equity. They would have drained my accounts to buy Alexis a pony or a condo or a Bentley. Their indifference was my firewall. I bought nice things, but I kept them subtle. I bought a $3,000 blazer, but because I was the one wearing it, my mother assumed it was from a thrift store. "At least you're trying to look presentable," she sniffed, touching the fabric without realizing she was touching Italian silk. "Maybe you'll find a husband who can support you since this career thing clearly isn't working out." I just nodded. I let them paint me as the failure. I let them pity me. Every time they mocked my little computer games, I felt another layer of protection hardening around my assets. I wasn't hiding the truth. It was right there in front of them. They just lacked the clearance to see it. They thought they were starving me of attention, but really they were giving me exactly what I needed: the silence to work. The view from the 45th floor of the Seaport Tower cost $12 million. It was a panorama of steel glass and the dark Atlantic water. It was quiet here. There were no drafts, no slamming doors, no passive-aggressive comments about electricity bills. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city wake up, holding a cup of coffee that I hadn't made in a panic. My phone buzzed on the Marble Island. It was a notification from Instagram. My mother had just posted. I opened it, not out of masochism, but out of habit, like checking the weather in a city you used to live in. The photo was high definition. It showed Alexis leaning against the hood of the Bentley Continental GT. The car was a pearl-white monstrosity gleaming in the driveway of a house they had mortgaged to the hilt. Alexis was wearing sunglasses she couldn't afford and a smile that said she had never worked a day in her life. The caption read, "For the daughter who deserves the world. Proud of our girl." I didn't feel a sting. I felt a sense of clinical detachment. They had spent $240,000 on a depreciating asset to signal status they didn't possess. Meanwhile, on the coffee table in front of me sat the advance copy of this month's Forbes magazine. The cover was stark black and white. It featured a silhouette of a woman standing in front of a shipping container. The headline was in bold yellow text, "The Ghost Billionaire How, a 22-year-old disrupted the global supply chain from a bedroom in Boston." They hadn't seen the magazine. My parents didn't read financial news. They read country club newsletters. But the world had seen it, and inevitably, the sharks began to circle. It started at noon. My father, Mark, didn't call me to congratulate me. He called me because his phone had been ringing off the hook since 9 a.m. Venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and distant relatives were calling the house landline, desperate to get in touch with the founder of Logistech. They assumed naturally that a supportive father would have the direct line to his billionaire daughter. I let his call go to voicemail. Then he called again. And again. By the fifth attempt, I decided to answer. I put the phone on speaker and set it down on the quartz countertop. Savannah, his voice wasn't warm. It was trembling with a mix of fury and greed. What have you done? I founded a company, Mark, I said, taking a sip of my coffee. I thought that was obvious. You hid assets, he shouted. You lived under my roof, ate my food, and you were sitting on a fortune. That is fraud, Savannah. That is theft. You deceived this family. I protected my intellectual property, I corrected him calmly. There is a difference. My mother's voice joined in from the background, shrill and frantic. We sacrificed everything for you. We gave you a home, and you let us struggle. You let us worry about mortgage payments while you were playing CEO. The revisionist history was breathtaking. They hadn't worried about mortgage payments. They had worried about leasing luxury cars. We need to meet, Mark demanded, regaining his composure. We need to structure your contribution to the household, and we need to discuss Alexis. She needs a position. Vice President of Marketing would be appropriate. She has the image for it. I almost laughed. They were already carving up the carcass of a beast they hadn't helped hunt. They didn't want an apology. They wanted equity. They wanted jobs for the golden child. They wanted the prestige of my name without the labor of my past. I am not hiring Alexis, I said, and I am not restructuring anything. You made your investment choices. You bought the Bentley. You chose your portfolio. I am simply managing mine. You listen to me, Mark snarled, his voice dropping to a low, threatening register. You are my daughter. That money belongs to this family. If you think you can just walk away with it, you are sorely mistaken. We will take you to court. We will sue you for support. You owe us. I owe you nothing, I said. And Mark, check your credit score. I have a feeling your liquidity is about to dry up. I hung up before he could respond. I didn't feel fear. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a CEO identifying a hostile takeover attempt. They weren't family anymore. They were liabilities, and I knew exactly how to liquidate them. I didn't throw my phone against the wall. Emotion is just bad data in an audit. I deleted it. I simply pressed the end call button and immediately dialed a new number. This one didn't go to voicemail. It went directly to the private line of Arthur Sterling, the head of my legal team. Savannah, he answered on the first ring. Initiate Protocol 0, I said, and get a forensic accounting team on a retainer. The best one in Boston. I want a full audit of Mark and Stephanie's finances going back 5 years. Every transaction, every loan application, every line of credit. If they bought a pack of gum in 2019, I want to know about it. Understood, Arthur said. Do you want us to file the restraining order? Not yet, I replied, staring at the reflection of the city in the glass. First, I want the data. They declared war. I need to know their ammunition supply before I nuke the bunker. For the next 48 hours, I treated my family not as blood relatives, but as a hostile entity attempting a corporate takeover. I systematically sealed every access point they had to my life. I hired a private security detail for the penthouse, not because I feared for my physical safety, but because I refused to let them create a scene in my lobby. I instructed my assistant to blacklist their names, emails, and numbers from the company server. Then I sent the cease and desist. It was delivered by courier to their front door at 7 a.m. It wasn't a holiday card. It was a formal legal notice demanding Mark immediately stop using my name and the name of Logistech to solicit personal loans from investors. He had been calling my business contacts, people I had spent years building trust with, trying to leverage my success to cover his bad debts. He was trading on a reputation he had tried to destroy. By Wednesday, the initial reports from the forensic accountants started rolling in. They were pathetic. Mark's business, a boutique consulting firm he bragged about at dinner parties, had been bleeding cash for a decade. He was insolvent. He was surviving on credit card shuffles and high-interest loans. But the most insulting detail wasn't the debt. It was the taxes. Look at this, the lead accountant said, pointing to a highlighted line on Mark's tax return from 2 years ago. I leaned in. There it was. Mark had claimed me as a dependent. He had filed me as a full-time student with zero income, using me as a tax write-off to lower his liability. At the exact time he filed that return, I was paying 7 figures in taxes on my capital gains. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. He had literally documented my failure to the IRS to save himself $2,000 while I was secretly funding the infrastructure of the American economy. He committed tax fraud, I said, my voice devoid of surprise. That's the least of it, the accountant said, his face grim. He pulled a second folder from his briefcase. It was red. We dug deeper into the credit report you authorized us to run on yourself for the security clearance review. Savannah, we found something. It's not just about what he owes, it's about who he owes it as. I looked at the folder. The room went silent. The hum of the server room down the hall seemed to stop. I didn't feel fear. I felt the cold click of a puzzle piece finally snapping into place. "Show me," I said. The accountant opened the file. It wasn't just bad parenting. It was a felony, and it was going to destroy them. The red folder lay open on the glass conference table. Inside was a credit report, but it wasn't the clean high-score report I was used to seeing for myself. It was a secondary profile, a shadow financial identity attached to my social security number. "What am I looking at?" I asked, though. My brain was already racing to connect the data points. "You're looking at a home equity line of credit, 3 maxed-out credit cards, and an auto loan," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "All opened in the name of Savannah R. Sterling. All opened 4 years ago on the week of your 18th birthday." I stared at the auto loan. The date was recent. The amount was $240,000. The collateral was the Bentley Continental GT. "He didn't buy the car," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the gut. "I did." "Technically, yes," the accountant confirmed. "Mark used your personal information info he had because you lived in his house to open lines of credit in your name. He's been cycling the debt for years, paying off the minimums with other loans to keep the score just high enough to avoid red flags. But for the Bentley, he maxed everything out. He bet the farm on the assumption that you were a broke student who wouldn't check her credit report for another decade." The silence in the room was suffocating. This wasn't just bad parenting. This wasn't just favoritism. This was identity theft. It was a federal crime. My father hadn't just ignored me. He had harvested me. He had looked at his 18-year-old daughter not as a person with a future, but as a fresh credit score to be cannibalized to feed his golden child's ego. "He stole my identity to buy Alexis a toy," I said, the words tasting like ash. "He risked my entire future so she could look rich in a parking lot." "It gets worse," Arthur said, sliding a notification across the table. "Because of this massive spike in unsecured debt and the irregularity of the loans, your security clearance for the new government logistics contracts has been flagged for review. If this fraud isn't resolved immediately, and I mean criminal charges resolved, Logistech loses the Defense Department contract. That's a $400 million loss." I stood up and walked to the window. The city of Boston looked different now. It wasn't just a landscape of opportunity, it was a battlefield. My parents weren't just toxic relatives. I could cut off with a therapy session and a blocked number. They were an active threat to national security logistics. They were enemies of the state. And more personally, they were parasites who had tried to kill the host. I thought about Mark's arrogance on the phone. "You owe us." He truly believed that. He believed he was entitled to consume my life, to fuel Alexis's. He had looked at me shivering at a bus stop and thought, "She doesn't need a car. She needs to be the collateral for one." "Savannah," Arthur asked gently, "how do you want to proceed? We can go to the FBI right now. He'll be in handcuffs by dinner." I turned back to the room. My face was dry. My heart was a glacier. "No," I said. "Handcuffs are too easy. If he goes to jail now, he becomes a martyr. He'll cry to the family that he made a mistake trying to provide. I don't want him to be a victim. I want him to be an employee who just got fired." I picked up the red folder. "Set up a meeting," I commanded. "Tell them I'm ready to negotiate. Tell them I'm ready to sign a settlement. Make them think they won. I want them in this boardroom tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And Arthur, have the notary ready." "What are you going to do?" Arthur asked. "I'm going to balance the ledger," I said, permanently. They arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. Mark wore his best suit, the one he saved for closings he never landed. Stephanie was in Chanel, likely charged to a card in my name. Alexis trailed behind them, looking bored but expectant, like she was waiting for a table at a trendy brunch spot. They walked into the lobby of Logistech with the swagger of people who thought they had just won the lottery. They looked at the glass walls, the security turnstiles, and the bustling staff not with pride, but with the appraising eyes of new owners. I let them wait in the conference room for 11 minutes. It was a power move, yes, but it was also a calibration. I watched them on the security feed. Mark put his feet up on an empty chair. Stephanie critiqued the artwork. They were discussing renovations for a beach house they hadn't bought yet. When I finally walked in, flanked by Arthur and 2 security officers, silence was the only greeting they deserved. I didn't offer coffee. I sat at the head of the long obsidian table and placed the red folder in the center. So Mark said, leaning back and lacing his fingers behind his head. I see you've come to your senses. We're willing to be reasonable, Savannah. A lump sum of $50 million plus the VP role for Alexis, and we can put all this nastiness behind us. We're family, after all. I didn't blink. I just slid the folder across the glass. It stopped exactly in front of him. Open it, I said. He chuckled, a nervous grating sound. Is this the settlement offer? It's the indictment, Arthur said, his voice devoid of emotion. Mark opened the folder. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. It was like watching a candle be snuffed out. He saw the loan applications with the forged signatures. He saw the forensic tracking of the funds from my credit line to the Bentley dealership. He saw the federal statute numbers for identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny printed in bold at the top of the summary. You stole my identity, I said, my voice quiet and clinical. You committed federal fraud to buy a car for a teenager. And because of that debt, my clearance for a $400 million government contract is currently flagged. We intended to pay it back, Mark stammered, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. It was a bridge loan, internal family financing. It was a felony, I corrected. And here are your options. Option A. Arthur calls the FBI. They are currently waiting in the lobby. You go to federal prison for a minimum of 10 years. Alexis loses the car. Mom loses the house. You all lose your reputation. Stephanie let out a strangled sob. Savannah, you wouldn't. We're your parents. Option B, I continued, ignoring her. You sign this. Arthur slid a document across the table. It was a confession of guilt, a full assumption of the fraudulent debt, and a permanent, irrevocable relinquishment of all claims to me, my company, or my assets. It included a restraining order clause that triggered instantly upon any attempt at contact. If you sign, I pay off the fraudulent debt to clear my security flag. I don't send you to jail. But you never speak to me again. You never say my name. You disappear. Mark looked at the document. His hand shook so badly, he could barely hold the pen. He looked at Alexis, who was staring at him with wide, horrified eyes, realizing for the first time that her luxury life was built on a crime scene. Sign it, he whispered. They signed. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the room. It sounded like a zipper closing on a body bag. When they were done, Arthur collected the papers. The transaction was complete. They were safe from prison, but they were destitute of me. One last thing, I said. The checkbook lay on the table. My pen moved with slow, deliberate strokes. I tore the slip out and slid it across the table to Mark. He looked at it. His eyes narrowed in confusion. $2.75. What is this? Reimbursement, I said. For the bus ticket. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. You see, Mark, relationships are like bank accounts, I explained, leaning forward. For 22 years, you made withdrawals. You withdrew my confidence, my safety, my time, and eventually my credit. You overdrew the account. You bankrupted the relationship decades ago. But I am a fair businesswoman. I believe in clearing the books. I stood up. That check covers the very last investment you ever made in me. The cost of sending me away. Now the ledger is balanced. The account is closed. Get out. They didn't move at first. They just stared at the check, the physical manifestation of their total devaluation. Then the security guard stepped forward. My parents stood up looking small, gray, and defeated. They walked out of the glass room past the billions they would never touch, holding a check for less than the price of a coffee. The fallout was absolute. Within 24 hours, the Bentley was repossessed, not by me, but by the dealership, once the fraudulent loan was exposed and canceled. The rumors in their social circles started as whispers and ended as headlines. Fraud has a way of staining people that no amount of dry cleaning can remove. Mark and Stephanie were ostracized from the country clubs they worshipped. Alexis, stripped of her vehicle and her status, had to get a job. I heard she works at a retail counter in the mall now. She takes the subway. As for me, I didn't celebrate with champagne. I celebrated with infrastructure. A month later, I stood at the podium of the same auditorium where I had graduated. The room was full, but this time I wasn't looking for faces that weren't there. I was looking at the faces of the 300 students sitting in the front rows. They were all wearing coats that looked a little too thin for the weather. They all had laptops that looked a little too heavy. They were the invisible ones. I am proud to announce the launch of the Transit to Tech initiative, I said into the microphone. Starting today, this foundation will provide full-ride scholarships, housing stipends, and yes, transportation costs for every student in this city who relies on public transit to get to their education. The applause this time wasn't polite. It was raucous. It was the sound of doors opening. I looked out the window at the gray Boston skyline. I finally understood the nature of true justice. It isn't about burning your enemy's house down. It is about planting a garden they are not allowed to enter. My success is the wall they cannot climb. My happiness is the language they cannot speak. I walked out of the auditorium and into the cold air. I didn't call a driver. I walked to the curb and waited. When the number 66 bus pulled up with its hydraulic hiss and the smell of diesel, I smiled. It wasn't a reminder of my pain anymore. It was just a ride. And I had a lot of places to go. If you've ever had to build your own castle with the stones others threw at you, share this story. You are the architect of your own future.